Hello, and welcome to your week 6 of your stress management and fitness course here at CIIS. This is your professor, Jacqueline Bergman. Today, we're going to focus on concepts from your NASM Chapter 7, and that's going to be specifically flexibility training concepts. So what will you learn by the end of this unit? By the end of this unit, you should be able to explain the effect of muscle imbalances on the human movement system. You should be able to provide a scientific rationale for the use of an integrated flexibility training program. You should be able to differentiate between various types of flexibility techniques. And finally, you'll be able to perform and instruct appropriate flexibility techniques for given situations. Okay, so let's begin with an introduction to flexibility training. So why is flexibility training important? Like you might imagine, and when you engage in flexibility training, that's really just going to help your client prevent injury and help optimize their workout. So you can have a client that's really motivated, is willing to put forward 100% to move forward with their program. But if you aren't implementing proper flexibility training, you could actually be harming and limiting your client from reaching their full potential. So really important to incorporate this component into a training program. You should also know the definition of flexibility. So the scientific definition of flexibility is the normal extensibility of all soft tissues that allows the full range of motion of a joint. Okay, the more the muscle tendons lengthen, the greater the range of motion will be. Most of you all hear the term flexibility. You can already imagine what that means, but you should know this scientific definition here. Okay, so how do we actually develop poor flexibility development? So before we get into these techniques, let's talk about how poor flexibility develops. When we talked about subjective assessments, we talked about how important it is to really get to know the background of your client. And one of the things that might highlight is how they might have gotten themselves in a position of poor flexibility. So for example, if they're engaging in repetitive motions, I have a carpenter example. So if a carpenter is, standing on a ladder and has their core engaged and is continually hammering, with the same type of muscles over and over and over and over, that can result in poor flexibility. Injury. So if an individual sustains some type of injury where it's painful to move a certain area of their body, and then without proper physical therapy, what can happen is poor flexibility, right? Also, simple daily functioning. Let's say an individual is sitting at a desk all day, or even standing, as a cashier, or standing in some type of capacity all day without experiencing dynamic movement. That also can result in poor flexibility. Why do we care? Because we know that poor flexibility leads to relative flexibility. So you should know this term, relative flexibility. It seems pretty innocent enough, but it is something that you want to avoid. It is not a good thing. So relative flexibility is when the body takes the path of least resistance. Okay, so when your body wants to do something, even though you have poor flexibility, your body's going to figure out a way how to do that. Okay, so unfortunately, though, this relative flexibility is not how the joint is intended to move. And so what you end up doing is you end up engaging in faulty moving patterns. Okay, again, with repetitive motions, injury, daily functioning, that can inhibit your full range of motion in certain areas of your body, ultimately leading to relative flexibility, which is not a desirable result. More on relative flexibility. So for example, if hip flexors are too tight, the body needs to move into a hip extension to run, right? So let's say this is an example of you're trying to get ready to run, but your hip flexors are too tight. So what will happen rather is the body will find an alternative way to do the job. You're not just not going to run. Your body will do it, right? Even with those tight hip flexor muscles. So what happens over time? This leads to faulty movement patterns. So for example, the back arching to gain added range of motion through the hip. Okay, and then that is going to potentially result in injury, and also it will limit your client's optimal potential into engaging in this type of activity. Okay. What is altered reciprocal inhibition? So this is basically what relative flexibility can lead into. So when one muscle is being active, there's typically a muscle on the other side of the joint that is being lengthened. So that word joint should be joint. When we talked about different terms in our previous chapters, we did mention altered reciprocal inhibition, so we're just reintroducing this in a different context, okay? So again, when one muscle is being active, there's typically a muscle on the other side of the joint that is being lengthened, so that is just what happens, right? For example, during a bicep curl, triceps must lengthen to contract the biceps. So if you can't lengthen your tricep, you can't curl your bicep. So both ends of the spectrum are necessary. Okay, so what we're talking about here, we're not quite getting into altered reciprocal inhibition just yet. We're talking about what should happen normally. So all the things that we just talked about are naturally occurring phenomenon. However, altered reciprocal inhibition, this is defined as an overactive or tight muscle that decreases neural drive to its functional antagonist or opposing muscle. Remember, all of these muscles are talking to one another and ultimately talking to your central nervous system. And this type of conversation or integrated conversation your body has with your muscles and your central nervous system will result in altered reciprocal inhibition. So for example, if you're getting in position to run, and we know, so going back to that example we talked about, so you're getting into position to run with a tight hip flexor, your gluteals are going to shut down because of overactive activity in hip flexors, right? So the gluteals are weak and not able to apply as much force because of these tight hip flexors, okay? Then the body, like we talked about, it won't shut down. Instead, it will start to recruit other muscles to get the job done. So if you don't have proper engaging of the proper muscles that are supposed to move around a joint, that is going to throw off this kinetic chain that we talked about, right? So the wrong muscles are going to be engaged, leading an injury. Also, in this instance of running, the body will recruit another muscle like the hamstrings to do the work. This becomes problematic because then the hamstrings are really not meant to be the prime mover for hip extension during running. They're just supposed to be helper muscles. Remember we talked about this term, helper muscles or synergistic muscles or synergists. So in this example of running, it's hamstrings that are the synergists, okay? So when this happens, so repeated altered reciprocal inhibition leads to synergistic dominance. So as we're going through this lecture, we're seeing how all these different things lead to one another, okay? So altered reciprocal inhibition leads to synergistic dominance. So again, what is synergistic dominance? I say again because we learned this before. It's when a synergist takes over for a weak or inhibited prime mover muscle, which leads to poor movement patterns and potential injury. So in this last example, this over time, because the hamstrings is really meant to be just a helper muscle, if it engages in becoming the dominant mover muscle, then this will lead in sore hamstrings. But further than that, it'll lead to hamstring strains, which over time can really damage your hamstrings. Okay, so we talked about all of this foundational terminology, reintroducing some definitions we already talked about in previous chapters. But now let's talk about some specific flexibility techniques that you or your client can engage in to avoid this, some of these definitions that we had talked about, okay? So, well, in order to talk about flexibility techniques, we should talk about this concept of integrated flexibility continuum. So we're going to talk about different flexibility techniques separately, but we should note that they should be done in a systematic order, okay? In this integrated flexibility continuum that parallels the components of the OPT model. So it should be done step by step. So the three components of the integrated flexibility continuum include corrective flexibility, active flexibility, and functional flexibility. Again, these are parts of the systematic integrated flexibility continuum. So let's talk about these three different components separately, and then we'll get into more specifics, okay? So with the corrective flexibility component of the integrated flexibility continuum, it is designed to correct muscle imbalances. Okay, so this is done at the very beginning, that stabilization part of the OPT model, okay? The goal of this is to increase joint range of motion, also referred to as ROM. So range of motion is ROM, okay? What we want to do is correct altered joint motion. Forgot the T again, that should be joint motion. So within this corrective flexibility part of the integrated flexibility continuum, there are two techniques. We have self-myofascial or myofascial release, also known as SMR, and we have static stretching. Again, these are two techniques that are part of the corrective flexibility component of the integrated flexibility continuum. The second part of the integrated flexibility continuum is active flexibility. So this is a progression from corrective flexibility, and it includes two techniques. So you still should be engaging in SMR, or self-myofascial release, and also you should be engaging in active isolated stretching. Okay, so these two techniques are part of the active flexibility component of our integrated flexibility continuum. Moving on to the last part of the integrated flexibility continuum, we have functional flexibility. Functional flexibility is the last part of this continuum that parallels with the last part of the OPT model, and it's beneficial prior to explosive moments, and also before, which is also prior to athletic endeavors. Okay, so when you're really getting ready to engage in these higher level activities. So again, you're going to, or self-myofascial release, or SMR, is going to be very beneficial in this phase of flexibility training, but then also we're going to use dynamic stretching for functional flexibility, okay? So now let's talk a little bit more in detail of all these different components that fall under these three components of our flexibility continuum, okay? So what is SMR? SMR is used during all levels of the OPT model, or specifically all levels of these different components that we just talked about with regards to this flexibility, this integrated flexibility continuum. And I just have several images. This might look familiar to you all, that are familiar to any kind of exercise program. And this woman is engaging in SMR through this rolling here, so this foam roller, okay? So that's an example of SMR. But let's talk a little bit more specifically of what SMR is and how important it is, and sort of touch on the scientific rationale behind using SMR. Okay. So like I said, SMR is it's included in all phases of the integrated flexibility continuum. And basically what you're doing is you're applying pressure to the muscle using a foam roller. And what happens is you want to roll until a knot is identified. And once you identify this knot, which is a little harder than the rest of your soft tissues, you want to maintain the pressure at that area for 30 seconds. It might be slightly painful, slightly uncomfortable, but you want to do that for 30 seconds. And what does that result in? That results in autogenic inhibition. Okay? All you're doing is applying pressure to this knot, and that results in a very important autogenic inhibition, which is, by definition, a muscle that is being inhibited or silenced by its own receptors. Okay, again, autogenic inhibition, a muscle being inhibited or silenced by its own receptors. Okay, so SMP, you could also think of it as releasing muscle tension through pressure. Okay. So how does this work scientifically speaking? So basically what's going on here is the GTO senses the pressure on the muscle tissue as tension. Okay, so you're putting pressure on that tissue, it's sensing tension, and it creates an autogenic inhibition and causes the muscle to relax. So you're basically scientifically tricking, in a sense, these tight knots of muscles to relax. So really, when you have knots in your muscles, it's trapped tension. So you want to engage the trapped muscles again to move forward these trapped muscles so that you can promote muscle relaxation. Okay, so ultimately the goal is to break down knots so that the muscle fibers work more efficiently. Ultimately, what is SMR going to do? It helps calm down overactive muscles without having to lengthen them. Okay, you can already think about how you could think about how SMR in particular sort of parallels with other types of health concepts that you might be learning in your stress management, not stress management, but the IHL program within CIIS. Remember, we're talking about addressing sort of trapped emotional tension to release or to promote other areas of health, right? So you can see how that kind of parallels that here. But here, this is more black and white. We're looking at the science, the physiology behind trapped tension within a muscle and how we can release that through SMR. Okay. This is really helpful to use all throughout phases of training, and specifically even immediately after a workout. A lot of workout programs, if they're not engaging in SMR immediately after a workout, sometimes you'll have a rest day where you're just resting, but then also you'll have a stretching day that is just important or a flexibility really day that is just as important as an actual exercise day when you're engaging in strength training types of exercises. Okay, so SMR, very important. Okay, and here's just an image. It's not the best quality, but if you look at your textbook, you'll see some images, and basically what you see is you have these strains here. So this is again trapped tension, and you put pressure through SMR, which is going to ultimately send a signal to the GTOs, which will ultimately prime your muscle to relax. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about static stretching. So static stretching is going to be used during, when you're still in the beginning phases of, so flexibility techniques to be used when you're still in the beginning phases of the OPT model, okay? So this is a main corrective flexibility technique. It's reserved only for muscles identified as short or overactive during the assessment process. So you don't want to be engaging in static stretching, or you don't want to engage muscles in static stressing if they already are stretched out or overstretched. That will be counterintuitive. You don't want to be doing that. So you should be just specifically targeting short or overactive muscles, okay? So to perform a static stretch, you lengthen a muscle until the first point of tension is felt. So when you're just feeling uncomfortable, and then you hold it for 30 seconds. Okay, so you're holding that, and that is static stretching, okay? So static stretching uses principles of autogenic inhibition or reciprocal inhibition, depending on how the stretch is performed. And this is basically going to increase tissue extensibility, okay? Increases extensibility specifically of soft tissues. It improves joint range of motion. Keep on forgetting that TN joint, so it improves joint range of motion. Only stretch overactive, like I said, or tight muscles during this assessment process, or that have been identified rather during the assessment process. Because if you're stretching all muscles and some of them are lengthened or are healthy or normal, then that's just going to be counterintuitive to this, or counteractive really to this process, okay? So now let's talk about active stretching. So active stretching is the second part of the integrative flexibility training continuum, okay? So basically it's a progression from our static stretching. And what we're doing really is engaging in active isolated stretching. What is that? It is used during strength level of OPT model. Okay, so active isolated stretching used during the strength level of OPT model. It works to reduce any latent tightness from previous workouts, and ensures full range of motion is contained. So it's just a second step beyond static stretching, okay? So basically, you're going to use the same exercises that you use during static stretching. However, you're going to move into that stretch. So it's a little bit more active, slightly more dynamic. And then you hold that stretch for 1 to 2 seconds. So you hold it very short and repeat it for 5 to 10 repetitions. Okay? So you're basically pumping this type of stretch as opposed to holding as you do with static stretching. Okay? So it's really helping you move to that other level of flexibility. So some more on active isolated stretching, which is part of our active stretching phase of the integrative flexibility continuum. So that's second of 3 phases. So active isolated stretching, you can do this by performing stretching in this manner. So by engaging in active isolated stretching, you use reciprocal inhibition to increase joint range of motion, okay? So you're allowing your muscles to talk to your central nervous system, and that's really priming optimal flexibility, okay? Last but not least, we have functional flexibility. So that's the third phase of the integrative flexibility continuum that is parallel with the OPT model. And what that includes is, well, you still want to be engaging in SMR during functional flexibility. Remember, you're doing that in all phases of the flexibility continuum. But also, you're going to be engaging in dynamic stretching. So what is dynamic stretching? That is the active extension of a muscle using force, production, and momentum through a full range of motion at higher speeds. Okay, so you're putting a little bit of weight into this flexibility activity. Okay, what this does is it primes muscle extensibility like active isolated stretching, but you're just adding a little bit more challenge to the movement, okay? And what this does is it activates the prime mover muscles all throughout the body, okay? You're taking it to the next level. So what is dynamic stretching? You typically do one set of 10 repetitions, okay? So one set, 10 repetitions of at least 3 different exercises, of up to 10 exercises. So you could see how stretching can be dedicated just one day of a 7-day training program, okay? So you do one stretching day, one rest day, and then you work out, upper body on the next day, lower body on the next day. So it really can be a part of or should be rather, a part of your complete training program. Okay, so again, dynamic stretching, one set, 10 repetitions, 3 to 10 exercises, but these are just exercises that you're putting a little bit more challenge to your body. So I have a couple of exercises, examples. You have more in your textbook. You can actually Google and see these little types of videos in action if you'd like. Just look into dynamic stretching. So for example, you have hip swings, okay, back and forth. You do that for 10 repetitions, and then you move into something like lateral two walking, where you have a little bit of resistance going on and you just move the muscles accordingly. Okay? So more on dynamic stretching. So with dynamic stretching, we know that it optimally warms up clients for power level work or prior to athletic competition. Okay, because of the more intense nature of dynamic stretching, it can be used as both flexibility and cardiorespiratory warm-up portions of the day. So when you're just warming up to do a workout, you can use this. Okay. And that concludes our highlights. So the main highlights of your flexibility training concepts. So, we looked at some definitions behind how improper or poor flexibility develops, and then, really focusing in how you can correct these. So I hope you enjoyed this highlight, whether you're watching or listening in to the audio. I encourage you to just breeze through your chapter. And at the very least, I'd have posted a summary page. Really great way to start memorizing all of those different types of definitions that are pertinent to this flexibility training concept unit. Okay, I am logging out, and I will see you, or we will hopefully engage in conversation either through our talks, through discussions online, or just next week through our next presentation. So see you later.